This is the recorded lecture for October 24th. This is actually the lecture that was supposed to be November 7th, but because of the power outage, we are working on a slightly different schedule. You completed the biodiversity lab already today, and I've already handed that one in. This lecture is going to cover the thrushes, the mockingbirds and thrashers, the starlings and the mynas, and the cuckoos. First up, we have the thrushes. For thinking about thrushes, you're going to think about birds like the robin or the wood thrush, bluebirds perhaps, for getting the idea of a size. These are birds that are considered alert. They are upright in their posture, but rather compact, not overly long, not overly tall, small to medium songbirds, and they hop around the ground as they are foraging. You won't see them walking, but you will see them hopping. Generally, this group is colored in the brown tones with spotting on the breast, but some of them are brightly colored. And we find that the juveniles frequently have spotting to their underparts. When you see an American robin, you may discover that sometimes it doesn't have a completely red or reddish colored chest. Instead, it will have a reddish colored chest with white or black spotting. If you see that, it is likely a juvenile of those birds. There are some thrushes that do have obvious sexual dimorphism as we go through the groups, but for the most part, that's not overly common. They tend to live in woodland and open area habitats, and they're well known for their songs, which sound like songs, not like screeching, but they tend to be melodious. The thrushes are also called the turdid family. These birds are pretty large as a family, and they're related to the Old World flycatchers. There are two groups that fall in this. We have the true thrushes, which include the bluebirds, the solitaires, the spotted thrushes, birds like the wood thrush, the hermit thrush, as well as the robins. The chat thrushes include the Old World group, and then the blue throat and the northern wheat eater. These birds in the chat thrush group include a lot of birds that were probably familiar to the first American settlers, and that may be why some of our birds in this group are named like birds in Europe, even though they have none of the same relationship, but they look similar to those birds. So they named them the best they could based on their understanding of ornithology. There are some subspecies of spotted thrushes, but the rest tend to have a generalized single species. This gives you an overview of the different types of birds that are included in the thrush family. Some of you may have seen the eastern bluebird or the veery or the hermit thrush so far this semester. I don't know that you've seen most of the rest of these, but those are very common birds to this area. And then two others you likely have, one you've definitely seen is the American robin, but you may have also seen the wood thrush. And another bird that falls into this group is the varied thrush. Our thrushes are foraging generalists. They will eat a wide variety of animal food. They will eat worms, they will eat arthropods, they will eat fruits, they will eat grains if they have to. They will eat a large variety of food types. They will forage through the ground looking for their food, and because they're a generalist, they're going to tend to eat whatever they come upon that meets their food requirements. They, as they're hunting, are going to hop along, pause, toss leaves around with their bill to try and see what's underneath of them or on them, searching actively with their eyes to find food. And you will see that they are frequently moving their head as they do this. The reason they're moving their head, you would think with some other birds, is for sound, but it's not. These birds are moving their head around in order to see everything around them. So the spotted thrushes, the robins, and the varied thrush tend to feed from the ground exactly like I just described. we find that the robins will feed in really large flocks, but not everything else in this group does. The bluebirds are a very different type of feeding thrush. They tend to be in smaller groups, and they glean insects off of foliage. So you'll see them not hopping around on the ground or sitting on a perch and then diving down to the ground surface, but you'll see them going and actually picking the insects off of the undersurfaces of leaves and things like that. The thrushes, because they eat so many different types of food and because of the type of habitat they're found in, are very important for dispersing different types of seeds from different plants. The robin and the bluebird are important for dispersing the eastern red cedar, the Townsend solitaire for the junipers and mountain ash, and the spotted thrushes are very important for the distribution of the seeds of the Virginia creeper, the dogwoods, the black tupelo, and the spice bush. So by eating the fruits or the leaves or the seeds, really, of these, so the fruits or the seeds of these plants, they will then defecate later, and the hard portion of the seed that contains the seedling may still be there. And as it is, and as it develops into a new plant, the bird is helped by moving it from place to place, when really what they've been doing is eating food and then defecating the waste later. The breeding is set up similar to some of the other types of birds that we've talked about so far. The males are the ones that will first establish territory. They return, if they migrate, to the area first. They look around, they find a territory they like, and they will then do what they need to attract a female bird to them. They have established their territory. Their territory is going to have great areas for roosting as well as for finding food. And the idea is that they have provided a potential mate with a great territory. And these birds are relatively considered monogamous. And for the most part, they are. There are some species that will have extra pair copulations. Once again, that's the idea that a male or a female of an established pair could mate with a male or a female that is not from their pair. The wood thrush is considered polygynous, and the Townsend solitaire does do quite a bit of extra pair copulations. They will also do egg dumping, where they lay their eggs in the nests of other Townsend solitaires. For the most part, they're monogamous, with the bond lasting through the mating season, which usually correlates to 2 different clutches of eggs for these birds. The exact size of the territory of each of these birds, or birds in this group, is going to depend on the food quality in the area. Is there enough food? Is the food that is there of good quality? Is there access to water? Those things will matter, because the territory serves as the primary foraging area for the pair and for their offspring. So they need to be sure that they have a territory that is rich enough in food to support not only 2 adults, but also their offspring. They will place their nest near the center of the territory, but they are then going to make sure that they defend their territory. They will first sing, especially the male, to advertise his presence, that this is a territory that's been taken. When a rival comes nearby, they're going to somewhat aggressively go after him. Not that they're going to physically touch the rival, but they will posture towards it as though, I'm very strong, you can't come near me, this is my territory. They will snap their bill at him. They may also gape their mouth, so they'll open their mouth as wide as possible. They may almost make a hissing-ish noise as they're doing this. And then eventually it may lead to direct combat over the territory. As they posture, they may raise their crown feathers, flick their wings and their tails, making themselves seem much larger, as well as potentially ready to get into violence. If they do engage in direct combat, first it will start as chasing one or the other. That way you're still giving your rival a chance to get away. They will then, a couple of you noticed this behavior actually during the behavior lab that we just did. They will grapple, where they may, if they're in flight, engage each other with their feet, where they're kind of tumbling to the ground, interlocked in their talons. And they may try to knock each other off of any perches that they get by dive bombing at their heads. So the direct combat could be dangerous. The reason birds don't immediately go there is because there is a big risk to getting injured yourself through direct combat. The thrushes have a wide range of songs, and they do have the ability to communicate many different types of messages through song. Things like there's a presence of danger, or the communication between mates. They also use it to defend their territory. There are different songs used during migration to keep the group or the flock in cohesion. And then they have some songs that we really don't understand well. Their songs can have complex patterns, and there's a lot of variability, not just between the species, but also between individuals of the same species. But the thrush group is considered to be some of the best singers, really, when you're looking for a melody or a musical song of the birds, especially in North America. We have examined their songs and have found that their songs, there's mainly two different types. There's the innate type that is pre-programmed into the brain. This is the song that they are born knowing. And then there are the songs that they have learned. So having both songs that you're born with and songs that you're capable of learning from the community at large allows them to have a much larger vocabulary for their singing. And they also are known for having separate call notes, which each single individual functions, especially things like the danger and the territoriality. There's maybe part of the song, but they're usually going to be part of this call note feature. And these tend to be the difference between a call note and a song tends to be the call notes are very short. It may be a couple of different notes as opposed to a couple hundred of notes in a song. The conservation is kind of interesting for this group. And the eastern bluebird has been declining. It had declined for a number of various reasons. It's a neotropical migrant, and it's relatively sensitive to fragmentation. There was concern about stress on the wintering and breeding grounds. Maybe that high fragmentation meant there were more cowbirds around, and this is true for most of these groups that where we've been worried about them, that fragmentation has led to parasitism by cowbirds. What we've noticed is, though, that the bluebird benefited from aggressive action with installing of nest boxes. As we installed the nest boxes, it gave the bluebirds another place to nest, and they've benefited greatly. Their population is now rebounding. The mountain bluebird is also benefiting from these boxes, but the western bluebird is not doing as well. It's declining pretty rapidly. One of the things that it's dealing with is also the loss of stopover points, collisions with cars and other things. There's a chance in areas where we do not see a massive decline in a single species that what's really going on is not that the species overall is not declining, but that birds from other areas are coming in to kind of fill the void that would have been left. So you may see that mountain bluebirds in your state or your town are doing fine. And you may not think that there's a problem, but when you look at the species overall, you may see that it is having a decline. And we are having to do that now because there's areas that are seeing local declines, areas that are seeing local increases. But what is the average member of the species doing, declining or increasing? The American robin is increasing considerably. We believe that's because it does so well in habitat fragments and because of its ability to adapt well to human life and living in and around humans. That's allowing it to really see its population increase dramatically. The wood thrush and the veery have faced major declines for a variety of different reasons. The wood thrush has declined about 55% since the 1960s, and it's considered one of the most prominent examples of a declining forest songbird in North America. The veeries have had declines over the last century. They've declined pretty steadily since the 1960s, of about less than three quarters to a full percent each year. We believe that they are declining because their winter habitat is in South American forests, specifically in areas that are now being converted to agricultural lands. So as their wintering ground moves from forest to agricultural land, the amount of available food to them is going to decrease. As their food availability decreases on the wintering grounds, the fewer birds will survive the winter to return back to North America. Additionally, their northern breeding forests are being fragmented through our actions in North America. The Bicknell's thrush and the gray-cheeked have just been separated as separate species. The Bicknell's was part of the gray-cheeked thrush for a long period of time. The Bicknell thrush has one of the most restricted breeding and wintering ranges of any North American bird, which already puts it at risk. And then when you consider the fragmentation that it's dealing with of its habitat, the loss of wintering habitat, and the effects of acid rain, which decrease the invertebrate population, it is not in a great spot. Both the wood thrush and Bicknell's thrush are listed on the watch list as birds to be especially concerned for. Our next group you all are relatively familiar with, the mockingbirds and the thrashers. This would be your catbird and your northern mockingbird. We call this group the mimids. Mimids are considered medium songbirds, and their big claim to fame is their vocal repertoires and mimicry ability. They can mimic just about anything that they're capable of hearing. They range in color from brown to grays. Some of them have pale underparts or streaking, like you see on the northern mockingbird. They tend to live in forests, but they can also live in deserts and steppes situations, and the catbirds and the mockingbirds have done a great job of adapting to human environment. This whole group may not seem like they have a ton of things in common, but they are all 10 primaried songbirds, meaning they have 10 primary flight feathers, and they have a general appearance and size that is remarkably similar. The northern mockingbird is well known for its mimicry, and it does have a distinct white wing patch. If you look at the picture of the northern mockingbird at the top left of this slide, you will see that very clear white wing patch. The gray catbird is thrush-like in its shape, but its song style is like that of the mockingbird. Great mimicry, large repertoire, and it does fall inside of this group. It is not a thrush, even though it looks more like a thrush. The majority of our mockingbirds and thrashers do not have geographic variation in the species, so they tend to have only a singular species all over. However, we find that the sage, sage thrashers, Bendier's thrasher, and gray catbird do have some small level of variation, especially dealing with differences in elevation. And there are subspecies to the long-billed thrasher, the LeConte thrasher, and the curved-billed thrasher. One bird that is not common in North America, but is becoming increasingly more common, is the Bahama mockingbird. It comes from the Bahamas, and it is now seen as a visitor frequently in South Florida. It may eventually be a bird that is found here a considerable portion of the time. This gives you an idea of the type of birds that will be in this group. Now you may be looking at the brown thrasher at the top of the slide and going, oh, that one looks really, really familiar. That looks a lot like the veeries and the wood thrushes that we just looked at. And there is some similarity, but their body structures are remarkably different. The shape of the body is very different, the shape of the legs. The gray catbird is in here, the California thrasher, the northern mockingbird, and the ones you're likely to see this semester are the gray catbird and the northern mockingbird, which I believe everyone has already seen, and then the brown thrasher. These birds feed on insects and fruit. In the non-breeding season, they feed almost entirely on fruit, and up to 50% of their diet in the non-breeding season is fruit. They are pretty non-discriminating in the fruit that they will take, but their favorite fruit of all is berries. It doesn't really matter which type of berry. They will eat any berries that are available to them during that point in time. I pointed out the white patch on the northern mockingbird's body on its feathers, and you might have wondered, well, what's the purpose of that patch? Well, we believe the purpose of that patch has to do with feeding. The northern mockingbird feeds on the ground, it runs, it hops after its prey, and in order to actually gather its prey items, it's developed this white wing patch. As it moves its wing, what will happen is that that patch will suddenly become very obvious, and it may startle the insect that they are targeting. And by startling that insect, keeping it from moving, they will be able to then gather it up more quickly and consume it. The thrashers are called thrashers in part because of how they feed. As they feed, they use their bill to sweep back and forth through leaf litter. They pick up leaves, they pick up twigs, and they toss everything aside. It kind of looks like they're picking up a mouthful of things and shaking their head from side to side, throwing it all around. And they will find the insects they're looking for that way. And they can actually pick up a considerable amount of things. There's one of the thrush species that's capable of picking up with its beak something that weighs 1.5 times its weight. So these are relatively strong birds to be able to do that. They may also dig holes in the ground as they search for their food. They'll use their bill in order to dig a hole, and they will open it wider by sticking the bill in and gaping the mouth open to push the sides of that hole apart. They will gather in flocks when feeding. That's not a problem for this group. Northern mockingbirds are remarkably territorial during the breeding season, however. And it is worth noting that these birds will eat other types of vegetation matter. Some will eat cactus seeds. Others are well known as predators, agricultural pests really, of grapes, oranges, and other types of crops. The birds in the mockingbird and thrasher group are relatively monogamous. There's been a few reports that there have been a couple northern mockingbirds that are polygynous. But we find that some of the birds in this group form a monogamous bond for many years, like the lecontes or the curved-billed thrasher. Courtship displays are important before pair bonding, but this unfortunately is not going to include any of the crazy dances and other things that we've talked about. We're going to see, though, that the northern mockingbird uses 2 of the positions shown on this slide. It has several displays that include things like an elaborate flight display, where it is displaying its body to the potential mate, and it will pair that with a song. And the more interesting a song is for a northern mockingbird, the more likely he is to find a mate. It's not about sounding like everyone else they're used to, it's about having some new innovation to that song. That might mean a new mimic that you've learned. It could mean the order that the song is done in. The wing flashing that is used to startle prey by mockingbirds is also used in territorial defense and as a way to get the attention of a passing by female mockingbird. The gray catbird raises its head up and down, kind of bobbing its head up and down, sometimes displaying the red patch on the head and neck, and it will fluff its body feathers to seem even more attractive. I've mentioned the fact that they are great mimics, that they have a large variety of songs, and it appears that they have some of the most complex songs and calls of all of the birds. We find that the male will sing songs for defense, to attract a female, to guard his female mate. But there's a high level of mimicry here. We know that their primary song is learned. It is not one they are born with, it is one that they in fact learn. But we don't know a whole lot beyond that about how they put together a song. We've discovered that once a phrase is learned, so once they've learned the ability to mimic something, they will keep it for at least 1 year. The northern mockingbird has been known to learn songs of other birds while wintering, such as the buff-collared nightjay, that is, or the thick-billed kingbird. So it shares wintering habitats with them, and it has developed their songs. The gray catbird has also picked up songs from its wintering grounds in Central America, where it has learned the songs of the brown-crested flycatcher. So these birds have the ability to hear a song in their wintering time, retain it, use it then when trying to attract a mate, and then keeping that song on the same breeding area and potentially still maintaining the song for at least another year. Whether or not these songs are maintained after that, we're not entirely sure yet. And while the mockingbird and the gray catbird are in fact excellent mimics, perhaps the best of all the birds, not everybody in this group has that level of complexity and mimicry to their songs. The brown thrasher, the long-billed thrasher, the Bendir's thrasher are very rarely able to mimic anything, or at least don't seem to often mimic things. Their songs, though, do tend to be in paired or triplicate phrases. And that paired and triplicate phrasing is common in a lot of these birds. Mockingbirds tend to call in triplicate. However, both the mockingbird and the gray catbird have complex, long songs, lots of phrases, lots of calls, repeating patterns, and a single song can go for 10 to 20 minutes for these species. So a single song can contain all of that information, all of the calls and songs in that perhaps up to 20-minute, maybe even longer time period. The majority of the songs by this group are done by the males. The females will engage sometimes in counter singing, where she will be singing back to him the songs that he has sung to her, or at least all of those that he's capable of singing. Singing is going to peak when breeding season starts. So as soon as they're getting ready to find a mate, this is when singing is going to become more intense. Because the main purpose of singing is to defend your territory and to attract yourself a mate. It would make sense that this is the time where it starts to get most intense. However, songs will continue throughout the season. There are other songs they will use for pair bonding in order to keep that bond healthy. Some they will use for territorially defending their area. And they will also sing throughout the year. We've discovered, though, that they will change their song depending upon their location. When they're further from their nest, they tend to be very loud in their songs. But as they get closer to the nest, they develop a new language of whisper songs that are much softer, much gentler, and very different from their songs elsewhere. We believe that could be a variety of reasons, perhaps as to not harass their offspring or their mate, but also maybe to not draw attention to exactly where the nest is. If you sound quieter, they're not sure exactly where you are if they're a predator, so they won't be able to target your nest as easily. Within this group, they also have species-specific calls for alarm noises and mate calls, so communication between mates, but also for alerts when there is a predator or perhaps another type of problem nearby. Overall, the populations of the birds in this group have been declining for about the last 20 years. We don't really know why. We haven't studied this too intently, and more information is needed about the numbers of the birds in each species before we can even determine whether or not they're declining or what exactly the reasons are. In the Southwest, we're seeing a transition from desert to agricultural lands, and urban sprawl. Those we believe are the driving factors because loss of habitat is going to lead to an overall loss of birds in an area. The Lecontes, Bendir's, curve-billed, California, and long-billed thrashers are all on the watch list. Lecontes is a species of concern for California. It was found in the deserts of the American Southwest as well as northwestern Mexico. And the areas where it lives tend to be some of the most desolate of everywhere. It has lost extensive amounts of its habitat to human development. And because of this, it's being pushed out of the areas where it's normally found. And the types of foods that it feeds on are also pushed out of these areas. So that is one that we are most concerned about. However, no one in this group is actually considered endangered. Even though their species may be declining, it doesn't mean that they're at risk of extinction anytime soon. Our next group are the starlings and the mynas. This group overall is an old world family. This means they're not really native to North America and South America, but they were mostly brought over. They're medium songbirds, strong legs, strong feet, dark plumage with metallics and iridescence in purples, greens, blacks, or blues. And some birds in this group have white, pink, and red colored feathers. Not the starling, but we'll see that with some of the mynas. They are very social birds. They live in large groups. They hunt in groups. They're not going to be incredibly territorial because it seems to be that sociality is important for these birds. And because of that, or not shockingly, perhaps due to that, they're also colonial breeders. So if they can breed in colony, it makes sense that they're frequently found in large groups. In the United States, we only have 4 species, and all of them have been introduced. And after we go through a little bit more about the biology of these, I'm going to share with you about how the starlings got here and exactly which famous author you have to blame for these starlings arriving in the United States. This gives you the 4 birds that are sometimes in the United States from this grouping. The European starling that you're familiar with, and then the common, the hill, and the crested myna. The starlings will eat a variety of plant and animal foods. They will eat insects, invertebrates, fruits, nectars, grains, bird eggs are actually fairly common in a starling diet. They tend to forage on the ground and they probe with their bill. These starlings are able to do this better than many other birds because of very interesting muscles they have that allow them to put their bill into the soil surface and open their bill widely while stretching the ground around them. As they gape open their mouth, it's going to create a hole in the soil. This allows them to winter in areas where other insectivorous birds cannot, because they can still break into the soil to get insects when these other birds can't. We believe this ability is directly related to their success as an introduced bird in North America. Without the ability of gaping wide their mouth and finding insects under the ground surface, they likely would not have been able to survive here. Mynas are a little bit different in their foraging. They tend to forage on the ground and they eat a lot of fallen fruit. In fact, mynas are largely frugivores. Frugivores. Frugivores are those who mainly survive on a diet of fruit. Starlings are mostly monogamous, as are mynas, mostly monogamous. The European starling males sometimes will switch different mates between different broods. That means they may have 2 broods with 2 different females during the year. When they do make this switch from one mate to another, for some reason they are much more helpful to the first female than they are to the second. That may have something to do with it being later in the season, that they're needing to get ready for molting and wintering themselves. These songs are pretty variable within this group. It includes warbling noises, whistle noises, and some of the birds in this group are also remarkably good mimics. Starlings are very vocal throughout most of the year, the exception being when they're molting. And these starlings can be good mimics. They've been known to mimic other birds, sirens, whistles from athletic games or from police whistles, and in a few instances, they've been known to mimic human speech, noises, and words. Most starlings are not migratory. They are, in fact, residential in their area, so they're not going to move. They will wander or become nomadic when food conditions are not what they would expect them to be. The starling is migratory in a few parts of where it lives, but not so much in Pennsylvania, at least not near here. And sometimes what happens is that they will migrate some years and not other years. Those that migrate tend to be moving down from the north or from high elevations. And it may be that even in this group, which appears to be non-migratory, that the ones that we have in the winter in Pennsylvania may have been in New England for the spring. So it may not appear migratory, but there may still be a movement. In the winter, these groups are found in very large numbers. They will roost together, they will feed together during the day, and it seems to be very instinctual for these birds to exist in large groups. And now for the conservation of starlings. It's worth noting that the conservation concerns of starlings and mynas are actually the fact that they're not native to the United States. All 4 species have been introduced. So conservation concerns are really about the fact that they're impacting other birds. They are a threat to cavity nesting birds because they also nest in cavities. And they're considered a pest by farmers, city managers, and others, especially for their ability to eat from agricultural areas and poop all over everything in cities. But you might be wondering exactly how we got them. And yeah, and about we have today about 200 million or more starlings. They're considered one of the most abundant birds in North America. They're found as far north as Alaska and as far south as Mexico. And they are non-native. And the author we get to blame for them being here is none other than Shakespeare. In March 6, 1890, a New York pharmaceutical manager by the name of Eugene Schieffelin took 60 starlings, which he'd imported from Europe at a relatively large expense, and released them in Central Park. Another group was released in 1891. The plan that Schieffelin had was to introduce every bird mentioned by Shakespeare in his plays to North America. He was part of the American Acclimatization Society, and they had already released many species of nightingales and skylarks, which are mentioned in Shakespeare's work, to the United States. But the nightingales and the skylarks hadn't in fact made it. They didn't survive. The expectation was the starlings probably wouldn't either, but they were willing to try. In an article that was in the Smithsonian magazine about this, the author was quite concerned because she didn't understand how the author didn't understand how this group could consider themselves bird lovers if they were releasing birds that they knew likely would die in the wintering time period. Because if you're really a bird lover, you're not going to release a bird with the expectation that it will die. But the starlings didn't die. They made it through the winter because of that strange ability that I mentioned earlier, where they can put their beak into the soil, open it widely, and get to the insects. Something that a lot of our native birds could not. So the starlings were able to survive the winter and continue living in the area. However, people realized that these birds were a pest relatively quickly. They tried to get rid of them, and they were largely unsuccessful. In Connecticut in 1914, people were trying to get rid of the starlings, so they took 2 very interesting approaches. Approach 1 was to fire rockets through tree branches when starlings were there, and approach 2 was to tie the very, very scary teddy bears to trees in hopes that the starlings were afraid of teddy bears and would not then nest in the trees. The White House took a different approach. They recorded owl songs, and they played owl songs in attempts to scare off the starlings. It didn't work. The U.S. Capitol put electrified wire on its columns in the areas where the starlings were living to try and get rid of them. And a variety of methods have been used to try and get rid of starlings, including shooting, traps, poisons, repellents, and anything that they could think of to frighten the bird. But the starlings are resilient, and they are still here. They don't really have any predators, they've got a lot of food, and they're capable of surviving in an area and outplacing a lot of the native species. So we can blame Shakespeare for these birds, but they're kind of here to stay. Our last group of birds for today are the cuckoos. The cuckoos are an interesting group. They are medium-sized birds. They do not have any close relatives. They have zygodactyl feet. They have a decurved bill, meaning that it does curve down at the end. Their tail is at least half of the bird's total length. So half of the bird's length is the tail. That means the tail is at least as long as the body is. The majority of the Old World ones are brood parasites, very similar to our cowbird. They're found in deserts, wetlands, rainforests, a pretty wide variety of areas. They're an old group of birds. The ones that we see most often here are the yellow-billed, the black-billed, and the mangrove cuckoo. They are generally dark above with light below, and their tail on the underside is spotted white. On average, the sexual difference is that females are 5% larger than the males. And here we have our yellow-billed, our black-billed, and our mangrove cuckoo. You can see, especially in the mangrove and the yellow-billed cuckoo here, those white spots on the bottom of the tail. Cuckoos tend to forage slowly. They spend a lot of time sitting and looking for insects and prey. They're not going to be as active foragers as most of the birds we've discussed so far this semester. But when they find a prey item they want, they're on it immediately. So once they find something they want, it's a very quick attack in order to get it. The yellow-billed cuckoos, it's worth noting, do not eat other birds' eggs. There have been other cuckoos that will eat eggs. The yellow-billed cuckoo does not, but it does something really fabulous for us. It specializes in eating tent caterpillars in the east coast of the United States. It can eat over 100 at a single sitting. Considering most tent caterpillars are pests on our trees, it's very remarkable. In the west, the yellow-billed cuckoo eats moth caterpillars, katydids, grasshoppers, and the occasional tree frog. The yellow-billed and the black-billed will also feed on areas where there's cicada outbreaks. And they will feed on these outbreaks because it makes a great swarm of food to feed upon. And that helps keep the cicada population in check. For breeding, our males are going to call to the females. They're going to make calls that sound like coos. They're then going to offer food to them. The exchange of food during copulation is very common for cuckoos. The female accepts the food and they will then proceed to mate. The cuckoos build stick nests, and both parents help build the nest. Both incubate the eggs, both take care of the young. We sometimes find that the yellow-billed will do communal nesting, where you have multiple pairs sharing a single nest. Their clutches of eggs will contain between 2 and 6 eggs. The amount of eggs laid is going to depend somewhat on the food supply. On years of good food, they lay more eggs. Years of less food, they will lay fewer eggs. And the chicks will hatch in the order that the eggs are laid. So that means they will eventually hatch asynchronously. The expectation is that most of them will still survive. This isn't going to be a case where sibleycide is extremely common. It may be possible, but they will tend to try to line up the number of offspring they're going to have with the type of food and the amount of food that their habitat can provide pretty well. By the time the young leave the nest, they are very large, about half the size that their parents were. They can't fly, though, and the parents will still continue feeding them for 3 to 6 more weeks. The yellow-billed and the black-billed will parasitize other birds' nests if food is abundant, because that allows them to lay more eggs, but they can't quite keep track of all that many offspring, so they're going to have to lay those eggs in other birds' nests. The yellow-billed will have unrelated helpers that will help with them, and these helpers can supply up to 40% of the food that their offspring need. In a very interesting thing, yellow-billed can sometimes have communal nests with other cuckoos, but they've also been found to have communal nests with robins and mourning doves. We're not really sure what to make of these interspecies communal nests, but we know that it is a possibility. The yellow-billed has become extremely uncommon in the West. It may be listed as a subspecies for under endangered. It is listed with several state agencies as endangered. The yellow-billed is vulnerable to extirpation, meaning that it will be extinct in a defined area, but not everywhere in its range, because of habitat fragmentation. And both the yellow and the black-billed are still common in the East, but they've declined in their populations by between 40 and 50% since 1980.